The following is a preview of a Patreon exclusive.
So this originally we were going to kind of cover all 6 episodes of the Light and Magic series on Disney Plus. That may have been we kind of made this decision on Monday or Tuesday of this week or whatever it was, but I think what we're going to do is split this up. Like there's enough here, I think, at least to keep it under a reasonable amount of time to discuss the first 3 and the last 3 of the first of the episodes. So we'll cover episodes 1 through 3, which would be Gang of Outsiders, On the Bucking Bronco, and Just Think About It. And then next week we'll pick up I Think I Found My People, which is part 4, Morphine, part 5, and No More Pretending You're Dinosaurs, part 6. All those titles are very clever. I really enjoyed them, and it's almost you kind of have to watch the episode to really kind of understand where the context of those titles themselves. So that's the format. So let's focus on the first thing, which is probably it is. It's probably the heaviest in terms of Star Wars related.
Yeah, that's where it all
Right?
begins, right?
Yeah, because by the time we get to episode 4, ILM's now kind of doing its own thing. They've gone the independent way or kind of independent contractor way a little bit to some extent, and they're going out and doing other movies, and so the series focuses on that. But it does diverge from almost 100% exclusively Star Wars content.
Right.
So with that, give me your opening thoughts on this because this was, the documentary itself. You and I were talking about it. There are some technical problems with this documentary. And I know people are like, "Oh, here we go." But no, first off, let me just say, like, as far as the content and the insight,
Oh, it's amazing.
it is the best. And I'm not being dramatic, and I do mean this with all my heart. I feel like it really is the best documentary that they've probably ever done on, well, certainly ILM, but just Lucasfilm and the genesis of Star Wars and the genesis of ILM, right? And THX and all that stuff. Like, yeah, I don't know if there's another one that's out there. And if you think about it, there's so many different bits and pieces that kind of we've gotten over the years, right? With a new release of a video or something, we get these side stories. But to me, this feels like the very first time someone has comprehensively gone in, pulled a lot of that together, right? Aggregated it. And then we've got additional layers of insight, background, context, or origins for some of the big players that started ILM, including George Lucas himself, which makes this feel like a very, very intimate kind of documentary at times. Uh, but my problems are really more on the technical side. So I'll
Yeah.
get into that here in a little bit. But what did you think is kind of opening thoughts about the series itself and what we were seeing in all of these episodes, really, not just the first 3?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think the only thing the only thing that exceeds this content from a behind the scenes perspective is the making of Star Wars, making of Empire, the JW Rensler books. I
Hmm.
think that's the only thing that you could argue is as comprehensive, if not more comprehensive. And again, those are dedicated to Star Wars, of course,
Sure.
and their giant books are like this thick, right? And there's 3 of them. So, but on screen, man, this is fantastic. The number of people they have, on interviews, the candid moments, the amount of video that they have of showing what they're doing and the conversations that were going on, and quite honestly, the candidness of some of the behind, like talking with George Lucas, and
Yeah.
quite honestly, just seeing George Lucas in a recent video was
Mhm.
really kind of surprising. This was made, and these interviews happened for this documentary for the most part.
Yeah.
And to have that, and to have this look back, and for even some difficult times like the John Dykstra stuff, it was just hard to watch it sometimes, not in a
Yeah, that
bad way,
was.
but it was just sad,
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
But yeah, it's just so well done. And yeah, there were some technical things that we could nitpick about, but man, the content and what they did, and just the sheer love and excitement, and you can truly see and get that feel for the pioneer nature of this company from its inception. But also you see George Lucas's fingerprints all over the industry once you watch this. And you just realize, I mean, because remember, when we heard about the digital revolution, it was 2000, it was making of Attack of the Clones, really, for the most part.
Yep.
As they were trying to go through and actually digitize everything. And that's when things got really, people hated digital. They didn't, they read the film purists were out and all of this stuff. But these were the building blocks, and these little things that we take for granted now. This series just shows you how important ILM was, and George Lucas as the embodiment and spirit of that company and pushing them forward and getting all of these amazing people, and the way that they found all these people was just incredible. And then what they were actually able to create over the last, almost 50 years now is just,
Hmm.
it's insane where they've gone. So this is definitely without a doubt one of my favorite behind the scenes videos that was, for Star Wars, I think, ever.
Yeah.
Way better than like what we got with Book of Boba Fett.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, this is the amount of work that went into this too. So, and that's the thing that I struggle with. Like, so again, I don't. It's nothing we're going to belabor, but the technical problems I had were some of the editing and the way it was cut, particularly the sound.
Yeah. The sound
Like,
was my biggest complaint.
what in the world is going on? Like, you could tell someone had chopped out. I mean, maybe it was just for the sake of brevity, and they were trying to take out like pregnant pauses and all of that stuff. But
Oh, but some
it's
like actually cut off
the
just
audio
yeah, like the
while they were talking,
natural, yeah. And you and I are nitpick because we do this every week.
right? Because we had shows,
Right. And we edit a lot of the show, make no
right?
mistake. But it's that natural, the echo of your voice and the way that it tails off, and it has to
Hmm.
naturally finish.
Yeah.
And they would just chop it to where it just felt like they just hit a noise gate and they
It
just,
was
yeah,
it was pretty, yeah. And maybe you're right. Maybe we're just hypersensitive because that's kind of what we do in our
it was
free
really
time
obvious
and
though
our
sometimes.
fun time. But yeah, but it's painfully obvious at times. So that aside though, okay, so that's really the only issue I had with it.
The only other one
I
I had was it was a little difficult to follow sometimes, not difficult to follow, but they did things out of order,
Yes,
which I
they did.
understand. Yeah, I understand that a little bit because they wanted to set the stage for everything in the first episode, and then they had to kind of go back and retell some things
Hmm.
from a different perspective in second. And then even in episode three, the third chapter started kind of going a little back and forth too.
Right.
And I get it just to try to contain a certain narrative. I get that, but it didn't feel as progressive until we got past episode three. I think that it felt much more, linear of where we were going.
Yeah, and I want to say it was episode 4. What was a good example of that? And I think I don't know if I messaged you or not, but Ben Burt,
Yeah, it doesn't
right?
show up until the fourth one.
Yeah, until episode 4. And
You
you
see the
think
back of
about
his
the
head in episode three.
what's that?
You see the back of his head in episode three
Oh, really?
he's
I
at the
didn't catch that
station. Yeah, yeah.
editing.
Hmm.
Yeah, so, like, and that was, but you're right, like, there was times I'm watching, I'm like, "Well, wait, what about, this story? What about that story?" And then, true to, like, modern day Star Wars or storytelling, you just kinda have to stick with the whole series, and
Right,
they get around to it eventually. Even the potato thing, like, I mean, they kind of addressed that either as well, I mean, I should say, right at the beginning, but there were a lot of, like, these myths or tall tales or these legends of things that happened during the production of Star Wars that we've heard things about, right?
right,
But to finally see people say, "Yes, those were potatoes," or "Yes, that was bubble gum," or "Yes, that was a shoe in the background," and just how and knowing having the additional context as to what they were going through, like, everything was on the table, almost literally.
hmm,
Everything was on the table in terms of what they could do to pull off a particular shot, because they were truly pioneers doing things that no one was out there doing because it just didn't exist. They were making this up as they went along. True to form, there's a moment in there when they finally get to Raiders. I think it's in episode 4.
hmm.
And there's that infamous line of Raiders of the Lost Ark where he says, "I don't know, I'm making this up as I go." Right? I mean, that in itself is just kind of a amalgamation of ILM and how they got started and what they were doing. And there's some other good parallels too that I want to talk about here out of the gate when we get as we get into the first episode, with the rebellion and, the Galactic Empire and what was kind of going on in Hollywood. So,
Right,
so what I want to say was congrats to Larry Kasdan, who I didn't know was the director of all these
right.
until obviously I wasn't paying attention, or honestly, to begin with. But when I got to the very end, I was like, "Oh, wow. Like, what an interesting." Like, I had wondered what he'd been working on here in the last, like, 2, 3 years because 'cause he's been
Right.
pretty quiet, you know? But, I thought this was a great way, some really good insight into what was happening. I do like the way he stitched some of these things together, but you're right, it is kinda weird because it's not a traditional documentary where you're going through and it's very linear in terms of how it's being told. There is a kind of a lot of jumping back and forth, and once you get it, you're like, "Oh, okay, I understand why they did that." Whereas traditional documentaries, it's, not like that, so
Right. And when
okay.
I think about the sound aspect of it, this is very much about visual effects.
Mhm.
You know, the sound is a instrumental part of all of that, but it's like we didn't talk about the music either, right? Even though John
Mhm.
Williams is, of course, a huge reason for the success of Star Wars. This is really about the visual aspect of movie making,
Right. The light and
and
the
that's
magic.
right. Yeah, I mean that's the ILM, right? I mean that's what it was
Mhm.
supposed to be the practice of making these things and building them, making them work, making them seem real, and evolving them and pushing the envelope and pushing technology further, right? And you know, music became a or sound became a piece of that over time, but really that I mean, really was part of it at the onset, but for
Sure.
the purposes of this documentary, it was really the visual effects of the things that had to really go through this entire cycle that no one ever thought, you know, many people never saw coming, and no one really even knew this kind of movie could even be made.
Mhm.
I mean, and that was clear throughout it. I think when we get to episode 3, they start interviewing, you know, J.J. Abrams and Deborah Chow and some folks like that.
Yeah.
You know, and they're like, we had no idea this was even possible. Like that you could
Right.
actually make this kind of movie. This is unreal. This is unlike anything we've ever had.
Mhm.
And that's attributed to George Lucas's vision, but ILM being able to make it work.
Yeah. So let's start with the first episode, and the first one was Gang of Outsiders. The context and reference to the title of is again really just there are a bunch of people who were not on the inside. They were not part of Hollywood. They a lot of them didn't have jobs. They were working. They were kind of almost in their own niche club and not getting paid for it. A lot of these guys knew each other for well before they came together formally as part of ILM. But even just at the very beginning, like the best moments, some of the best moments in the series are both the beginning of the series and the very end of the series, the way they kind of wrap everything up. And of course, we'll get to that. But the beginning out of the gate, we have, I mean, Spielberg, Abrams, James Cameron's on there. They brought in John Favreau, Ron Howard, Steven Spielberg. My gosh, my favorite director of all time. But I mean, it's just like this rabid succession of comments and people just kind of expressing how much, how incredible Star Wars was to them, and especially the lighting, the industrial light magic, and what special effects did for them. It was just a testimony to what this, this company did at the very beginning. But to have those big names out there, and even later down the road, seeing them talk about the first time they saw Star Wars, which is something we tend to ask. I mean, we've only had a couple interviews now recently here, but we want that's kind of a valid question. It's always a fun question to ask about where did you first see Star Wars, right? It's almost like a
Right.
9/11 thing, or pick any horrible tragedy, unfortunately. But if you're alive, you always remember those things. And for me, it feels like for those of us that are really diehard Star Wars fans, we always remember, right, in some form, in some fashion, in some aspect, our first time seeing Star Wars, and it was just really cool to kind of see these big name players talk about Star Wars and the way that we talk about Star Wars and just how much of an influence it had on them, and not just Star Wars, but again, back to the point of the documentary, but the light and magic, the what ILM was doing and how they really just completely revolutionized filmmaking as we knew it in the 80s
Right.
and late 70s. But
Well, what was really interesting about it is like visual effects were really on the way out. And that was
hmm
incredible. I didn't realize that visual effects, when we think about Sinbad and we think about a lot of the shows that inspired the folks who did this work, I had no idea that those, I mean, I knew they were changing, but that this was
yeah,
a dying, not only a dying art, but it was just completely had no future and no one wanted anything to do with it was just incredible to me. When we think about what you and I have grown up with
hmm
has had this as part of it in its DNA since the very beginning, since the first movies we watched, whether it was Star Wars or not.
yeah,
All of these things have been in it, and then they really took off when you get to like Jurassic Park, right? And so it's just incredible to know that all of this that was going on would have been delayed potentially a decade or more without ILM and without George Lucas.
yeah. If you think about, there was a moment there, and part of the series too is it's heartbreaking too, right? Because you know what's eventually going to come. It's almost
Yeah,
like watching Rogue One, right? You know they're going to die. On some level, you know that these folks that are doing practical effects and doing puppeteering and doing, maquette backgrounds and all this stuff would eventually go away because even from the very first episode, you hear George Lucas, he makes that one comment back like in 19, I don't know, 78 or whatever about how he hates editing
yeah.
and he really wishes that this could be digital. And of course, this is yet another one of his visions that he wouldn't be able to come to realize until much later down the road. But the writing was on the wall that those positions would go away at some point, right? Those were becoming dying arts. You go back to the film industry and where that was at the end of the 70s, and they had pretty much, I mean, I don't want to take anything away from the folks that were still creating science fiction at the time or special effects, which there really weren't any of, but they had already kind of hit the ceiling in terms of what they could do with practical effects, right? We
Right.
probably peaked outside of the endeavors and all of the ingenuity that went into creating ILM. We probably had tapped out and were at peak non ILM special effects, right? Everything had already kind of been done, and it was either going to be stop motion animation, or it was going to be weird practical effects where they're overlaying different, um,
Yeah, the opticals. Right.
yeah, all the optical stuff that they were doing. But there needed to be a revolution, right? And that's kind of what happened here with these guys as well.
Yeah, for George Lucas, it was all about motion. So 2001: A Space Odyssey was what, 72, 73, something like that.
Really, I thought it was
I think it
sooner.
was, yeah, oh, maybe so. It was
I'll look it up.
anyway. It was several years, before any of this, and so, but that's what George Lucas was. It was inspired. He's like, okay, we have this really cool thing, and the visuals are great, but everything is so slow. Yeah, everything is
Yeah,
just so slow.
68.
Eh, 60. Okay, there you go. I don't know what I'm thinking about with the early 70s, but but he wanted more motion, right? More action, more. He likes speed. We know he likes cars. We know that he did American Graffiti. So he wanted to take all of those aspects of it and put it in space and have it be this big adventure and have this, really exciting space battle. So you're right. To make that happen, with what they were doing and of how they had to do all of those effects, it just wasn't going to work. You just couldn't do it. And so it was really incredible to see what he wanted and just how far he was willing to push, even though you could tell it. I mean, throughout this whole series, man, you can just see the toll it took on him for that first movie to be made. I mean, gosh, you just, when you see some of these videos, you're like, I don't know how he's going to survive.
Yeah,
Just like straight up. I mean, he thought he was having a heart attack at one point too. But
right.
I mean, you just don't see how he's going to survive. But to go back to your original point, though, where all of these folks came from, and this is the really cool thing, and this is kind of more management, and kind of corporate speak or business speak, but it rings so true, and this documentary really highlights it. Is that you can have a visionary person, and they don't. And George admits he is like, I'm not a leader.
Right.
I'm horrible at leading people. I give very vague directions, but he gives them a lot of freedom. But what he is good at is finding people, and he finds good people who then know how to find other good people, and
Mhm.
gives them that freedom to do what they need to do within a certain context and structure. But that's the freedom that he gave him, and he found people like John Dykstra, who found like Joe Johnston, who I think is way underappreciated next to Ralph McQuarrie. I think in some ways, when Joe Johnston, his visuals really shaped a lot of Star Wars as well. And I'm not taking anything from Ralph McQuarrie, clearly, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Joe Johnston was as instrumental when you get to the storyboard level, and some of the things that he was drawing was just incredible. And they are Star Wars about how we got there.
Mhm.
But then all of the people, I mean, and all the people part of this thing, like Phil Tippett, Dennis Murin, gosh, I mean, Ken Ralston, even when they started getting towards, what's his name? Ed Campbell. I think that's how you pronounce his name, with the computer effects and where that started going.
Oh, later down the road, yeah.
Yeah, it's just incredible, all of the different people that they found. And it was like, oh, well, yeah, I don't do that, but I know a guy that does,
Right.
and then how
Yeah.
much of a, what show it was for a while, until they bring in, a couple of people to
Rose.
get yeah, Rose in particular. And I forgot the other guy's name. They were kind of a team just to get everything on schedule. It was just incredible what they were, the chaos, but also how do you rein in that chaos? And again, you just find other good people, and it all just starts to work somehow.
Yeah. Another thing that was kinda cool for me as I was watching this is, even now what's happening as you were kind of evoking all these names, right? The Phil Tippetts and the Murins and all that. Like, these are names that if you're a Star Wars fan and you were growing up with these movies and you're watching all the behind the scenes footage, or you had subscriptions to different magazines and there was interviews in there. I mean, these were like legendary heroes, and seeing them on screen and all together like that, and very candidly at times. I mean, there's a little bit later, I want to say it's in episode 4 or 5 where Phil Tippett's just being completely honest about,
Three, yeah,
is it 3? I don't
yeah,
want to spoil that, but we'll get to it here in a little bit. But, stuff like, I mean, there's just things about this that I had no idea. Like,
hmm
so much of this was like, it was a mixture of, I've heard that before, or I've heard it and I know that's real, right? or I've heard it. I've never heard anybody actually say it or seen anybody actually say it and kind of validate that that's really what was happening. And then there was a lot of moments in here where even as a Star Wars fan, and I'm not like, there are all kinds of levels of Star Wars fandom out there, right? And there are the people that are way more plugged into the BTS stuff than I am, right? Because they're in the industry or they're aspiring filmmakers or whatever, and they eat, breathe, and sleep this all day long. And for them, this is probably a bore. They probably knew a lot of this stuff. But for me, I'm always focused. I've always primarily been focused on like the visual, like what's happening in the story and the mythology and what we do on the show, that kind of thing. And I don't really necessarily spend a lot of time in the technical details, but this was pretty eye opening for me to see some of this stuff and really kind of understand what was going on in the background. And like you said, I mean, in some ways, this is kind of like landing on the moon. Like it's just a part of George Lucas.
Hey everyone, it's Jonesy. We hope you've enjoyed this preview of the Patreon episode. If you'd like to listen to the episode in full, we invite you to head over to cantinacast.com/Patreon. Access to this episode begins at the $2 After Dark tier. If you're interested in joining a future Patreon episode, we encourage you to check out our Now Part of the Tribe and Delusions of Grandeur tiers. You can find all the details at cantinacast.com/Patreon. On behalf of Albert and myself, thank you all for your continued support, and may the Force be with you.